In World of Warcraft's lifetime, there have been many strange builds and specs theory crafted in the community. Many turn out to just be suboptimal compared to the mainstream specs, and therefore become tagged as a meme spec. But occasionally, these anti-meta specs actually turn out to be more viable than the mainstream specs in niche situations and environments, like for instance speedrunning, gold making, and PvP. Many on this list are in fact very viable specs to play. I've also focused on not featuring specs from previous patches in the original Wrath of the Lich King. All these specs you could spec into after watching this video. Some were known to the community in the original Wrath of the Lich King, but some have been born from the Wrath of the Lich King Classic theory crafting community. By the way guys, just before we jump into the video, I want to talk very quickly about a side project that I'm working on. I'm working on a fictional short story series that I eventually want to turn into an episodic podcast on all the major platforms like Spotify. There's a little teaser on my second channel which you will find a link for in the description of this video. To sum it up very quickly, I normally write within the steampunk fantasy genre, although I am very heavily influenced by spy thrillers. As you guys know, I'm a huge James Bond fan. And then some stories will be more focused on that swashbuckling adventure style. But anyway, let's get on with the video. The first addition on this list is the Death Knight's Master of the Necropolis build. Parsing culture is a big thing in World of Warcraft. It's a way players create competitiveness and challenge when the game is no longer providing that, because the raid content is on farm due to the raid team simply being too powerful with all of their brand spanking new gear. One way to improve parsers is to obviously speed up kill times, and a min-max method of doing this is to spec your tank more tailored for DPS. Now there's many ways you can spec a Blood Death Knight to optimize his DPS, but one of the coolest ways to do this is to pick up Master of the Ghoul's talent in the Unholy Tree to give yourself a permanent ghoul. Not only is this a boost to your DPS, but the DK can use Corpse Explosion on the ghoul or other corpses for great spike AoE aggro, something the DK lacks compared to other tanks. And honestly, as a DK, there isn't really much great tanking talents if you really inspect the talent trees compared to other classes anyway that have more specialized talent trees dedicated to tanking. This means as a DK tank there is so many different ways that you can spec. Honestly, as long as you pick up the Will of the Necropolis talent and tanking cooldowns like Vampiric Blood, you're good, and you can really mess around and customize the talent trees. I could make an individual video of all the different DK specs, so let me know in the comment section if you think I should do that. Now we have a lesser known healing build, the Priest Soul Sprint spec. Most priests in Wrath of the Lich King Classic play Discipline since it's a very strong spec, and very often the holy spec is overlooked. For instance, many people probably don't know about the talent Body and Soul that causes your power word shield to increase the movement speed of a target by 60% for 4 seconds. And if you combine this with the Soul Warding talent that reduces the cooldown on shield by 4 seconds, it means the spell has no cooldown. Which means this build can be very useful in speedruns because some classes don't have many speed increasing effects or cooldowns. So between the cooldowns of rocket boots and other items, they're going to be moving around pretty slowly in a raid. For instance, obviously, a Warlock. With this build, you will lose a little bit of your AoE healing and AoE healing mana efficiency, but you can spec into the mental strength talent for 15% more intellect, which when you're in pre-raid gear actually provides 3.3k extra mana. So in itself, this hybrid utility build is very useful for when you're gearing up, because early on having a small mana pool and running out of mana is still very much a problem. Or you could just be boring and go and play Discipline, I guess. By the way guys, we are trying to get 18,000 subscribers by the end of the year. The condition of that actually happening is I will quite literally dye my hair green. So you've got a couple more days to smash that sub button. And I guarantee in my next video you will see me on webcam with bright green hair. I have quite literally bought the hair dye. Warlocks have always had very customisable builds, particularly in PvP, as every different pet introduces different playstyles and builds. But not many people know about the Fire Demon spec. This is also known as the hybrid build, but that's a bit more of a boring name. It combines the best talents from Demonology and Destruction together. Obviously this is suboptimal compared to just playing normal Demonology spec, but it is still probably double the damage of a Rep Paladin. Many of the Demo talents have very good synergy with Destruction talents. For instance, Molten Core increases the duration of Immolate by a total of 9 seconds, and Improved Immolate increases its damage by 30% on top of Emberstorm for another 15%. You will also use the Immolate talent, increasing its periodic damage by another 10%. This means you get a lot of value out of just casting one Immolate. Molten Core procs also reduce the cast time of Incinerate by 30%, and this stacks with the 0.25 second reduction from the Emberstorm talent. Molten Core also stacks with Backdraft rather interestingly, but I don't know of anyone experimenting with that. But during a Bloodlust, this causes your Incinerate cast to be less than 0.5 seconds. It is very, very, very fast. The synergy also helps buff the damage of the Imp by a country mile, since you will combine the Demonic Power talent that reduces the cast time on the Imp's Firebolt by 0.5 seconds with Improved Imp and Unholy Power. Obviously the downside of this build is you don't get to pick up those big juicer talents at the bottom of these trees. And these talents will always provide the Warlock with higher DPS. However, at level 35 you can pick up all of the Imp talents in both trees with Glyph of the Imp, and with everything combined that is a 90% increase to the Imp's damage, and his Firebolts are only a 2-second cast time. This turns your Imp into a pretty lethal machine gun, and with Fel Synergy and Mana Feed, health and mana for the Imp just aren't something to think about, they aren't a problem. This is a very fun and niche way to level a Warlock up in Wrath of the Lich King Classic, so take advantage of it when you hit level 35. Now we return to the Death Knight to talk about a very recent genuine meta build for the Unholy Death Knight called Endless Outbreak, or the more boring title that most people use, Improved Unholy Presence build. This was popularized by the Chinese parsing community, who discovered that when boss fights have very fast kill times, it's a DPS gain to stay in Unholy Presence, especially if you pick up the Improved Unholy Presence talent that causes your runes to regenerate 10% faster. There will also be a little talent swap further up the tree to get Outbreak, since you'll be using Play Strike more often due to faster runes. 30% damage increase is pretty good. But you're still off-spec into Frost to pick up Endless Winter. But again, this build will only be a DPS increase over the mainstream Morb build if the boss fights are short enough. In Wrath of the Lich King, the warrior gained a reputation for being an insanely good leveling class and dungeon cleaving class, so good in fact that they can actually solo dungeons. This is down to the Unrelenting Revenge spec that synergizes the arms and the protection talent trees. The talent Unrelenting Assault reduces the cooldown on Revenge to make it basically no cooldown, because it will be less than a global cooldown, and Improved Revenge increases its damage even more and causes it to attack another enemy. This means that Revenge does an insane amount of damage, so the warrior can be a competent tank who deals good damage. Again, this helps with parsing, but warriors mainly use this spec for solo instance farming since it is so powerful, whether that's leveling or gold farming. But to be honest, when raid teams are on progression content, this build very likely won't provide enough survivability to deal with the damage of bosses. You can actually apply the same philosophy to the Protection Paladin with their AVENGER'S Crusade build. This is a Paladin tanking build that focuses more on DPS than survivability. To be honest, the talents don't change incredibly much, since the DPS increase in talents like Reckoning and One-Handed spec are normally already picked up by Protection Paladins anyway. There's just a few more Retribution talents that you're going to go for, but you will mainly optimize your Paladin around glyphs and gear instead to increase your DPS, like for instance the Glyph of Avenger's Shield that increases its damage by 100% but prevents it from cleaving. They will also gem and enchant strength instead of stamina and pick up DPS trinkets like Dark Moon Card Greatness and swords like the Horseman's Blade for the expertise. Expertise is a very desirable stat for a try-harding parsing tank because they are always facing the boss and have an increased chance therefore for their attacks to be parried and dodged. On cleave fights, a paladin can push a respectable 9k DPS, which in my opinion isn't bad for a tank. It's going to help reduce the overall kill time a lot and therefore improve everyone else's passes. And they're probably not too far behind a rep paladin, let's be honest. The rogue has a couple of niche specs that are very useful in unique situations. For instance, the focused adrenaline spec that is a hybrid combat and assassination build that picks up focus attacks and vitality for really good energy regeneration on top of some defensive talents and glyphs like Glyph of Evasion. The main philosophy of this build is to optimize your energy regeneration to spam Fan of Knives more, to get the highest AoE DPS possible out of the class. This is great for farming trash in Karazhan for gold, for instance, while also clearing trash packs in raids, namely for speedruns. In a raiding environment, you will swap for the Focus Flurry spec that focuses more on DPS. There is actually a number of different ways that a rogue can optimize their build. For instance, they may want to strike a balance between single target and AoE damage for speedruns. And then there's even some more unique builds which are better for passing on cleave enemies where you can actually DPS multiple enemies and it still counts towards your pass DPS. Rogues also found a very overpowered interaction with the Titan Steel spell power weapon since it's a slow weapon and Fan of Knives scales off weapon damage. It means it deals more damage than any other dagger right now. Foul Striker is also a very strong weapon for AoE situations since Fan of Knives causes the proc to proc very often. And if you have guaranteed criticals very frequently, you're doing a lot of damage. I mean, I've seen rogues dealing 70k DPS on trash packs. Their AoE DPS and speedrun viability is insane right now. In Wrath of the Lich King, the mage always had an alternative build that was very viable, but unfortunately became less viable as expansions progressed and was eventually removed. So of course we are talking about the Frostfire mage. Currently on shorter fights, the Frostfire mage will do more DPS than the standard Fire Mage spec, so this is a perfectly viable spec that people are using. It's a powerful spec because it can benefit from both fire and frost talents, like for instance Icy Shards that give the spell 100% increased crit damage, and then things like Empowered Fire that increase the spell power coefficient of the spell by 15%, and not to mention how the spell can also cause Ignite and give you hot streak procs. The spec also requires much less hit chance and it's more mana efficient with the Frost Channeling talent and Master of the Elements talent. So it's one of those cool specs that benefits from the best of both worlds. Now for number 9 I want to talk about the SPELLHANCE Shaman because there is a lot of misconceptions about what this build is. Because really it isn't a build, yet so many people still think that there's this hybrid elemental and enhancement shaman build out there. The truth is, the SPELLHANCE Shaman is just a shaman with some spell power gear pieces on it. You see, the enhancement shaman can benefit from both melee and spellcaster stats, so sometimes a spell power gear piece will actually be a DPS upgrade for an enhancement shaman. This is because the enhancement shaman can convert intellect into attack power and vice versa attack power into spell power. Plus, with the Maelstrom weapon proc, it means they use a combination of casted abilities and melee abilities. So basically, every enhancement shaman could potentially become a SPELLHANCE Shaman. They just need to equip spell power gear. Sometimes they will do this if a spell power piece is a DPS increase on Sims. And lastly, we have a classic meme spec, the SHOCKADIN. Now, the SHOCKADIN isn't as bad as people think. In Wrath of the Lich King Classic, it's pretty decent and you can push arena rating with the spec, and definitely have a lot of fun in Battlegrounds. A similar spec to this is also a Retribution and Protection hybrid spec called the Prot Ret spec, but that's been talked about to death, so we're talking about this one today. A Shockadin has a very good burst damage because it takes advantage of the Holy Shock ability combined with the Art of War ability that makes your Exorcism an instant cast. And then add Judgment, Crusader Strike and Hammer of Wrath to the mix, the Paladin has a lot of bursty instant cast abilities, and Shockadins can take advantage of this bursty damage because most opponents think that they're dealing with a Holy Paladin, and therefore they don't expect the spike damage to just fly out of nowhere. And obviously they are also a half decent off-healing support class to bring to a 3v3 team. The great thing about the old school talent trees is how it allows players to experiment and have fun with the customizability. Unfortunately for retail players, this element of the game has returned with the new talent system trees added in Dragonflight. Now remember guys, please check out the teaser for my short story series on my second channel. If it gains enough interest, I will finish writing the stories and put it on a podcast format like Spotify and whatever else there is out there. And who knows, maybe in the future I will actually self-publish the collection in some kind of physical form. Anyway guys, until my next video, ciao.